So obviously we're still working on the Infinimist Necromancer, we're not done with it, and I'll probably be playing this all the way up until 8-8 when I'm going to have to retest Blood. But I got a question from chat which was basically like, can you explain the skill order for how you're playing the game? That'd be really helpful. And I do think that would be really helpful, right? You know, it's easy to write a guide that says like, do this, but I think that a video could go a long way to help people understand the concept of a build maybe a bit more deeply. So just to start off, we're an Infinimist build. That basically means we want to be in Blood Mist as often as possible. Blood Mist is really important because it generates corpses. It applies damage to all the targets around it. We also have an aspect which says that it applies a shadow damage trail underneath it. The reason why that's so important is because ultimately what we want to do with this build is basically be proccing as many instances of Corpse Explosion as possible. We want to have a bunch of lucky hit abilities to be able to reduce our cooldowns. And Shadow Blight says every 10 times you deal shadow damage to a target, they're going to take a big instance of critable damage. So this damage can crit. So when we're going to initiate onto a pack, we want to be an Infinimist because it makes us immune. It also makes us unstoppable. Also gains us a movement ability because it gains us a little bit of speed. But while we're going through, we also have an aspect that is exploding or explosive mist. That means that we're going to be consuming corpses for free as we go through. On top of that, we have Sacrilegious. So all these things are going to be consuming corpses and hopefully applying damage over time effects, which can proc Abhorrent Decrepify to reduce our cooldown. And we want to have as many instances of damage going simultaneously, because unlike some other lucky hit abilities, Abhorrent Decrepify just says when the enemy gets hit, so that can proc off of any of our damage instances. So the vast majority of the time, all you really want to be doing is using Blood Mist through a pack of monsters, and if you look very closely at our cooldown, you notice that it drops precipitously when we were not successful at proccing it enough to immediately go back into Blood Mist. Is the reason why we have all of the other skills on our bar, basically. That's why every other thing exists. So we use Reap to generate a corpse, we use Corpse Tendrils for crowd control, as well as a crit damage bonus and a crit chance bonus. It also brings everything into a small area to be able to apply Vulnerable. Vulnerable is a great way of scaling all of our damage because Vulnerable works with damage over time, whereas crit damage only works with the Shadow Blight. Now we also have Bone Storm. Bone Storm is clearly a great skill because we can turn that into a Darkness skill as well, so it can proc all of our Darkness skill abilities. It also procs twice per second as a damage over time ability, so that's a lot of additional lucky hit procs. And then on top of that, it also spreads Darkness damage. And then lastly, it also applies Shielding Storm to be able to generate barrier every time it deals damage to a target. This means that when standing in the middle of a giant pack of monsters, we can basically permanently maintain a bunch of lucky hit procs, barrier procs. Barrier is also really important because that generates additional lucky hit bonus from stats that we can now get on our gear. We used to have to trade our gear over to a sorceress character and then re-roll them at the enchanter to be able to get them. Luckily, we don't have to do that anymore. And that also just generally increases our damage and survivability by giving us critical strike chance as well as damage reduction. So now that we understand all of that, right, we want to be inside of Blood Mist as much as possible. We want to be proccing as many damage instances as possible. What about having Corpse Tendrils on the bar? Well, we need that for Sacrilegious to proc, but we also want to be able to do that manually. So whenever we come out, you basically want to cast Corpse Tendrils again if Blood Mist isn't off cooldown. Because even though Sacrilegious will do it for us, it only does it once every 6 seconds. So we want to also use it whenever it's off of cooldown. And then the big benefit is, well, we have all these really powerful skills that are all relying on cooldown, and all those lucky hit procs help to make it so that Bone Storm is up more rapidly and Corpse Tendrils is up more rapidly. The other benefit of Reap on the bar, not only to just generate a corpse on demand once every 4 seconds, but also gains us damage reduction whenever we use it. There's another defensive aspect you can use on your build called the Might aspect, which generates 6 seconds of an additional 20% damage reduction. And then the other funny part about Reap itself is it deals damage in an AoE. It has an okay lucky hit chance, like with our lucky hit bonuses, it has 29% lucky hit chance, but it's also a Darkness skill. So quite frankly, if you have no corpses, you can actually just sit here reaping, and you'll notice that given enough instances of Reap, we can actually proc Shadow Blight as well off of Reap. Keeps up damage reduction. If the monster dies, it also gains us increased attack speed, so that can be nice for manually casting Corpse Explosions when we come out. And you won't see me doing it a lot against packs of monsters like this, because there's so much density that we can actually manage our lucky hit. But against single targets, big bosses, and tanky elites, we actually want to be casting Corpse Explosion as well. Sacrilegious, the Malignant Heart, will do that once every second for us, which is good enough in big packs, but it does reduce the damage of the Corpse Explosion, and my personal version of Infinimist is still looking to maximize AoE dot damage. I know a lot of people have just moved over purely to crit. I'm going to eventually run numbers to truly see like just how impactful each one of those two things are for overall damage output, but it kind of comes down to playstyle. They're both, I think, equally viable and are slightly stronger and weaker in different scenarios, but being able to manually cast your own Corpse Explosions means that you're not going to get any negative damage bonuses or damage reductions on them from Sacrilegious. And then on top of that, if you hadn't seen recently, I did prove, and obviously a ton of people already know this, but there's always some holdouts who don't believe. You can have as many Corpse Explosion instances on the target simultaneously as possible, as long as you can maintain permanent corpses and cast them fast enough. So Corpse Explosion is on the ground for 6 seconds. If you could be recasting a new Corpse Explosion once every half second, that means that by the end you could have 12 corpses all dealing their damage simultaneously. And while the damage numbers stack on the screen, their individual lucky hit chances are calculated as if they were all their own instances of damage. So while the game is, adding it all together to make it less visually noisy on screen, you absolutely get the lucky hit from each individual instance of the Corpse Explosion. So even if you don't prioritize the damage, literally just casting more Corpse Explosions more quickly means that you're able to proc Shadow Blight more quickly. So every fight basically comes down to engage with Blood Mist so that I'm immune to all damage, and applying a ton of AoE dot damage. And then the follow-up question is, did I successfully reset my cooldown? If not, what are my options? One, you can activate Bone Storm for additional damage, like I already said, in additional damage instances. I missed one of the objectives, I'm going to go back. 2, do I need to reap to generate a corpse if all of my corpses have been consumed? 4, do I need to Corpse Tendrils myself? And the answer is basically always yes, you should have Corpse Tendrils currently on cooldown, if it's not currently on cooldown, to be maximizing your damage output. And then lastly, and this is going to be a little bit different when we get out of the season, do I need to reapply Decrepify? Because you have to remember right now, while you can't see it on my character, I do have the Decrepify Heart currently active, so let me just take that off and put it back on. I currently have the Decrepify Heart active, and this is casting Decrepify for me, but you initially would have to cast Decrepify. So in the normal rotation of the skill, you would go, okay, do I need to recast Decrepify? The answer is typically yes. And instead of fully initiating on Blood Mist, you would instead walk up, cast Decrepify, and then initiate with Blood Mist. So obviously it's going to be a little bit different season to season, but right now you also kind of need to ask that question, do I need to proactively cast Decrepify? Especially if you need to stay far away from a target, you may need to cast Decrepify on them, like if they have a really strong Fire Enchanted aura, and you're generating corpses on top of them, but they're not very mobile. I'm thinking of like a cult leader here. Those guys can really hurt sometimes. So do I need to reapply Decrepify is the last question that you need to ask, depending on season versus non-season and whether or not the monster is too strong to stand near. But that's all of the thoughts that you have and all the reasons why the Infinimist build works the way that it does. And while that was like a lot of word vomit, I think it would be valuable just to toss this up for people who are like brand new to the build. It's very easy for me to be like, oh, watch a build guide, that'll explain it. But I wanted to give this a bit more of a super in-depth, like literally why am I making the decisions I'm making at any given time, to hopefully allow you to navigate the build more efficiently and get a bit more out of it if you hadn't already been considering these questions. But thank you very much for watching. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.